It is day 8. It's been 2.5 days since my first big feeding. None of the starters have fully doubled yet, though some of them actually were about 50% doubled, but they sunk down just a little bit in the jostling as I moved them over here from the top of my refrigerator. But I want to take a look at each one of these briefly so that you'll see how each one is progressing. Here's our starter with rye and filtered water only, and you'll see we definitely got a good rise out of this. It was actually up to about here before I pulled it down from on top of the fridge. Really nice bubbles developing throughout, and that starter looks really good. The highest performing starter we have is the rye with pineapple juice. Tons and tons of bubbles. It's risen higher than any of the other starters. And we've got a really aggressive, bubbly, foamy surface on top of our starter, which is something that actually all 8 of our starters have. Our whole wheat starter with only filtered water, not quite as aggressive or impressive bubbling has developed, but we do have a little bit of a rise out of it, and of course the surface of it looks really, really nice. Our whole wheat flour with pineapple juice, pretty stark difference between the one made only with filtered water. You'll see the bubbles are much larger. We've gotten a significantly higher rise on this starter than we do on the other one, and a very aggressive activity going on here at the top of the starter. Our organic unbleached flour, strangely enough, is showing the least amount of activity of all of our starters. That certainly doesn't mean there's no activity. We've got plenty of bubbles forming here. Of course, activity on the top of the starter as well. And then the organic unbleached flour with pineapple juice here. Strangely enough, we're not noticing as many bubbles in this particular starter as we did in the starter that was made only with spring water. Fascinating. Our regular bleached all-purpose flour is showing a significant amount of activity, even in the starter here that was only made with filtered water. Look at all those bubbles. Here's the bleached all-purpose flour that was started with pineapple juice, and it is considerably more robust in terms of bubble formation than the one made only with water. But the good news is this bleached all-purpose flour did in fact harbor enough yeast to really get us to a really lovely spot here. So, all of our starters are active and healthy. The even better news is we haven't noticed any indication of invasion by bad molds or bacteria. We don't have anything unusual growing, discoloration, or any particularly off smells, though your starters will definitely go through a whole array of different smells, especially as they're getting going. So, all 8 of our starters are active and healthy, even though they have not yet been able to double themselves in bulk. Once your activity in your starter has reached its highest peak after a feeding, the starter will begin to deflate, and you'll notice a layer of liquid, that's predominantly ethyl alcohol, rising to the surface on top of the starter. Now that's not a bad thing, it just indicates that the feeding frenzy has started to slow down, and your starter would benefit from a feeding. So if you do notice that deflation and the water rising to the top, no problem. Give it a quick stir with a clean spoon to deflate it. Scoop out enough just back down to your original line, and then give a brand new feeding of 4 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of filtered water. But for me, my starters are still rip-raring and going, so I'm not going to do that until I start to notice that decrease in activity. See you when I see you. Day 11, and I have to confess, 3 days ago, right after I filmed this segment, I decided I want to go camping. And rather than leave my starters for 6 full days before their last full feeding, I decided I would go ahead, divide them in half, and feed them again. That happened 3 days ago, and look at them now. We have got some really robust, intense activity in our pineapple juice starters. All of them, in fact. Not quite so much activity here on the final bleached flour, but it's still really nice and bubbly and robust. Lots of bubbles within the matrix. They are doing absolutely wonderful. You can also take a look here at the starters made with just filtered water. And again, we actually do have quite a lot of activity in all of those. So all of our starters look really healthy and happy, though they may not be able to bake bread quite yet, but we're getting close. Now you'll notice we haven't gotten nearly a full doubling in volume after the feedings on any of the starters, even the ones that are showing really robust activity. So today I'm going to demonstrate a discard and feed so you'll know exactly how I'm doing this on all the starters. This is the whole grain rye started with pineapple juice. And the first thing that you want to do is stir the starter to deflate it. Then you're going to discard approximately half of it, about down to our first original line. And you don't have to be crazy precise about this. Now we're going to feed our starter since we're back down to about 8 ounces of total starter, 4 flour and 4 of water, we're going to at least double it by adding 4 more ounces of that organic all-purpose unbleached flour that I use, and 4 ounces of filtered water. Give it a nice good stir. Scrape down the sides so that you can see what's going on, and then leave it on the countertop. So I'm going to kind of keep track of this by checking in on it every few hours for the next day, just to see how quickly it reaches that peak activity. It's only been 4 hours since our last feeding, but shit is going down in all of our starters. Most noticeably, the pineapple juice starters, where we've got nice bubbling and rising going on in all of them, especially the unbleached organic all-purpose flour that has literally 50% risen in this 4-hour time period. We've also got plenty of noticeable activity in the filtered water starters, though not quite as much bubbling or volume gain as the pineapple juice starters. It's going to be interesting to watch these over the next 4 hours or so, because we may be only one feeding away from being able to make bread. We'll know soon enough. It has been 8 hours since our last feeding, and all 4 of our pineapple juice starters are just going absolutely nuts. The bleached all-purpose flour and the whole wheat flour have practically caught up with the organic unbleached flour in terms of their volume rise. Taking a look at our starters that were made entirely with filtered water, they definitely aren't quite as robust as the others, but virtually all of them show at least some volume increase, and we definitely have some nice small bubble structures scattered throughout the matrix. We may need another couple of feedings to get these filtered water starters up and running, but it's only been 11 days, and that pineapple juice method seems to have paid off. It is day 12, and look what I woke up to this morning. Overnight, our organic unbleached flour and pineapple juice starter went so nuts, so crazy, rose all the way to the top of the container. We know this because we can see the pattern of starter dried on top of the container. And the weight from the starter above it allowed this container to pressurize, and it exploded. It blew off the top container of starter, which spilled all over my kitchen floor. So that starter, unfortunately, is down for the count as far as this experiment goes. So at this point, it appears that our organic unbleached flour of the 4 flours we selected was really the winner. Of course, I can't say that for sure until it has baked a perfect loaf of bread before any of the others. Let's take a look here at the starters begun just with filtered water. They all show really strong signs of activity, some nice bubbles across the top of them, but they certainly don't have the interior carbon dioxide bubble volume that our pineapple juice starters have. So the pineapple juice has definitely improved our starter process and given us several days head start over just the regular filtered water method. Let's take a peek here at our pineapple juice starters. They are all absolutely nutso crazy, rip-roaring to go. And because our organic unbleached flour and pineapple juice did achieve a full doubling in 24-hour period, that means it is just about ready to bake bread. So what I'm going to do today is divide and feed all of the starters. Then I'm going to keep watch over them just like I did yesterday every few hours. For now, I'm going to keep them stacked. But I've learned my lesson that overnight, when I'm not watching them, I need to make sure that there's no pressure on top of the bottom starter in case I have another explosion. Now, this is called a blowover, at least in beer brewing terms. And you shouldn't be afraid of it because it tells you that your starter is mature and you have completed the starter creation process. So make sure as your starter starts to become very, very active, you leave it on the center of your countertop, and if you want to, you can put it inside a bowl to catch any of the starter that flows over the top. As long as you don't have highly pressurized weight on top of it, or if you're using a quart jar, if you've screwed that lid down tight so that it's airtight, you can sometimes get an actual explosion. But as long as some carbon dioxide can leak out if it's under pressure, you'll be just fine. Don't worry about that blowover. Because we know our organic unbleached flour is finally mature and ready to bake bread. After it's feeding, I'm going to give it 4 hours to really energize. Then I'm going to divide off 4 ounces of that starter to bake bread, give it a second feeding, and chunk it in the fridge. Now there's another thing we haven't really discussed with our starters yet, and that is problems. Because we haven't really run into any problems other than the explosive blowover. We're very fortunate that we haven't had any mold infections in the top set of starters that were made only with water. The bottom starters began their life with enough acidity to protect them against invasion by molds and bad bacteria. but the filtered water starters did not. Our early stirring and the early high hydration does definitely help with that, and we've seen that because we've had absolutely no mold growth on any of our filtered water starters. But if you do happen to notice a tiny spot of mold, if it's sitting on the surface of your starter, get a clean spoon, scoop all around it, take it out and discard it, and proceed as normal. But if the mold returns, you need to discard your starter and start over from scratch. What's more likely to happen is that you'll notice a little spot of mold growing on the inside wall of your container. That's because you get this thin layer of starter that sits up here. It doesn't have high enough acidity, especially in the early days, and dries out, and then the mold kind of invades and gets to feed on that. That's actually no problem at all. What you want to do is carefully from bottom up, scrape with your spoon to remove that spot of mold. Then I want you to heat up a tablespoon or so of vinegar in the microwave, add a pinch of salt to it, and then dip a paper towel or a clean wash rag into that salty vinegar and rub that area just to make sure you kill any potential mold spores that are left behind. We know that salt and acidity don't bother bread because our starter is acidic and we add salts to the bread when it bakes. So those two things are completely safe for your sourdough starter, but certainly not safe for mold. It's been 4 hours since our last feeding and all of our starters are showing a rise or an increase in volume, but take a look at our unbleached organic all-purpose flour. It has literally almost doubled in the 4-hour space from its feeding. So this starter is definitely, without question, mature. I'm going to go ahead and start a loaf of bread with it. Now, I'm not going to show you this full process. I have another video dedicated entirely to it. But there's some mathematics here that you want to keep track of. So my bread recipe calls for 4 ounces of starter. So I've got my scale tared out here at 0, and I'm going to scrape 4 ounces of starter into my bowl. Now that means we've got about 12 ounces of starter left in our container. We've been following this 1 pound model, and every time we feed our starter, we discard about 8 ounces or half of it, and then we feed it 4 ounces of flour, 4 ounces of water to keep it at a full pound. Now that your starter is mature and you're going to keep it in the fridge, you don't really have to do anything to it at this point if you don't want to. You can just put the lid on it, put it in the fridge. You know you've got about 12 ounces of starter left. And I'm going to eventually teach you, you don't really have to keep track of how much you've got, because when you start to get down low, you'll just at least double it to feed it again. Now, some of you may end up baking 3 or 4 loaves at a time. And if you've only got 1 pound of starter, that's going to make 4 loaves of sourdough at one time, but then you'll be out of starter. So if you ever plan on doing bulk baking, you might consider transferring the starter to a larger container. Now, because I regularly bake in bulk, I keep my starter in a significantly larger container than this. But this does take up more real estate in your fridge. So if you're only going to be baking a loaf of bread once a week, every now and then, just keep it in your quart-sized container and you'll be completely fine. Just know that after you've baked about 3 loaves of bread, it'll be time to feed your starter again. So I've got my loaf started here, and I'm going to use a Ziploc bag so that we can really see what's happening as this loaf begins to rise. Now at this point, you can just chunk your starter into the fridge because it's mature and it's ready to live its life in the fridge. The refrigerator slows down the process of the yeasts churning through that carbohydrate in the starter. You don't want that to happen too fast. If you left it out at room temperature all the time, you would literally have to feed it every single day. Putting it in the fridge slows everything down so that you really only have to feed it when you start to run out. To keep things symmetrical for my experiment and demonstration here, I'm going to go ahead and discard 4 more ounces of this. So I'm back down to my original sort of 8 ounce level and give it 4 ounces of water, 4 ounces of flour. After every single feeding, do let your starter sit out on the countertop at room temperature for about an hour so that the yeast start to get going, then you chunk it in the fridge. So always give your starter a 1 hour rest after you have fed it. So at 12 days, we have 1 fully active starter that's ready to last for the rest of our lives. I want to talk very briefly about feeding. You've heard me mention you don't have to feed as often as you've been told, and that's true. My mom fed her starter every single day, which is just a huge waste of flour. I hate discarding starter at all, and of course there are plenty of things that you can do with mature discarded starter, but I don't see any point in discarding starter when I have learned that you don't have to feed your starter until you're almost out of starter. So, my suggestion to you is, unless you're going to be baking the very complicated high hydration breads that require you to have a super mature, highly active starter right from the get-go, don't worry about getting on any kind of feeding schedule. When you drop down below your original line, give your starter 4 ounces of flour and 4 ounces of water at the very least. You could also do 6 ounces of flour and 6 ounces of water. Just remember that your starter is going to rise. So if your final feeding is anywhere above that midpoint, it's possible you'll blow off the top of your container. In that case, you just need to switch to a larger container, which is what I do. But only feed when you get down to the point where you don't really have enough starter to make another loaf of bread. And as I've said in my other video, I had a sourdough starter in the back of my fridge for well over 2 months without a single feeding. I didn't even feed it before I baked a loaf of bread, and it baked the most delicious loaf of bread that I've ever baked in my life because of all of that complexity that had built up in that starter over those 2 months. So don't worry about this taking over your life. Only feed it when it needs to be fed, i.e. when you need to make more of it, and you'll be good. It's been 8 hours since our day 12 feeding, and gosh darn it, it looks like every single one of these starters is going to be ready to bake bread tomorrow. Just one day after our Superstar starter reached that point. Actually, the least active of all of our starters at this very moment is the rye flour started with pineapple juice, which is the gold standard of all starters. It's really fascinating what you can learn when you do direct experimentation like this. The most robust of our starters is the whole wheat flour started with pineapple juice. After that, looks like the rye starter with filtered water. Close on its heels is the bleached all-purpose flour. Both of these starters, the pineapple juice and the filtered water starter, are super robust. And right after that, we've got the whole wheat flour started with filtered water. So I am going to stack these in a single layer on a cookie sheet just in case we have any blowovers in the night, and I'll see you tomorrow. Day 13, no blowovers last night. And looking carefully at the lids of each of our starters, it does not appear that the level of the starters rose all the way up to the top of the container. Now that's technically not necessary, we're just looking for a doubling in volume. But since we weren't there to see it, I'm not confident that it happened. So I'm going to give each one of these guys another feeding today, and we'll watch them throughout the day. Now let's take a look at the loaf of bread that we started with our organic unbleached flour that matured yesterday. We're still only at about 19 hours of rising time right now, but you can actually tell there's definitely a doubling in volume and a very beautiful fine structure of bubbles scattered throughout the dough. This is exactly what we're looking for. Now, the dough could have a little bit more vertical lift. I see that in most of the breads that I make with my established starter. But something tells me this is going to bake a pretty good loaf. I'm going to go ahead and give it 5 more hours so we've got the full 24-hour rise. Then I'll form it into a loaf. We'll let it rise again and toss it in the oven. Our starters are all fed and happy, and don't worry, we may actually be able to go ahead and start loaves from some or all of these starters based on how they behave over the first 4 hours. Remember, yesterday, our Superstar starter, it literally almost doubled in 4 hours. And if any of those do that, that's a sign that that starter is mature. When I checked out my starters this morning, their activity was subsiding. They were significantly less active than they were last night. That's an indication that the yeast colony over a 24-hour period reached its peak and was starting to settle back down. So I'm guessing that all of these starters are actually mature. Remember, just because we didn't see it happen doesn't mean they didn't double overnight when we weren't watching. There's another thing I noticed that I wanted to show you. Take a look here. This is the side of the bleached flour starter before I fed it today. We have very clear signs of liquid streaks running down the sides of the container. Now we're scraping the sides of our container every time we feed our starter so that we can see visual clues like this. If you compare this to the side of a scraped starter, you'll see we definitely had that starter rise almost to the very top of the container, and then it subsided before I checked it out this morning. So let's give it 4 hours and see what happens. Now, I know a number of you are making starter right here along with me, so I'm going to go ahead and end this segment so I can get it online in the next few hours so that you guys know what to do after the first 5 days of your starter. So you're going to have to wait a few more days till I'm completely finished with this experiment to see the final results in the bread. Sorry about that, but I know you need to know what to do next.